Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Daniel Kahneman, the architect of cognitive error and dual-process mind. Together and apart, they illuminated the hidden machinery of thought, one through the symbolic depths of the psyche, the other through the measurable patterns of judgment and choice. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach the irrational in human nature, one seeing archetypal forces shaping consciousness from ancestral depths, the other discovering systematic biases distorting our perception of probability and risk. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most: the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Kahneman as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the spring of 1882, in the small Swiss town of Keswil on the shores of Lake Constance, a child was born who would spend his life mapping the invisible territories of the human soul. Carl Gustav Jung entered a world still dominated by Victorian certainties, yet already trembling on the edge of profound transformation. His father was a pastor, a man of faith whose certainties would eventually crumble, leaving the young Carl to witness the collision between religious devotion and spiritual doubt. His mother was mysterious, possessed of what Jung would later call a dual personality, at times conventional and predictable, at others strange and oracular, speaking truths that seemed to come from depths she herself could not explain. The boy grew in the shadow of the church, surrounded by the rituals and symbols of Christianity, yet also aware of something older, something that predated the cross and the communion wine. He would later recall dreams from his earliest childhood, dreams of underground chambers, of divine figures that both terrified and fascinated him, of a secret life that ran parallel to the ordinary world of schoolwork and family meals. These dreams planted seeds that would only germinate decades later, when Jung had the tools and courage to excavate their meaning. By the time Jung entered medical school at the University of Basel in the final years of the 19th century, he was already a young man divided between competing interests. He loved the natural sciences, the precision of anatomy and physiology, the way one could dissect the body and understand its mechanisms. Yet he was equally drawn to philosophy and theology, to questions that could not be answered with a scalpel or microscope. When he discovered psychiatry, he found a discipline that seemed to bridge these worlds, a medical specialty that dealt with the mind, that mysterious borderland between matter and meaning. Jung's early psychiatric work took place at the Burghölzli Hospital in Zurich, where he studied under Eugen Bleuler, one of the pioneering researchers of schizophrenia. Here, Jung encountered patients whose minds had fragmented, whose internal worlds had become so chaotic that they could no longer function in ordinary reality. But Jung did not see mere pathology in their delusions and hallucinations. He saw meaning, pattern, purpose. He noticed that the bizarre utterances of psychotic patients often contained mythological themes references to gods and demons, creation and destruction, death and rebirth. How could an uneducated Swiss farmer, who had never studied comparative religion or ancient mythology, spontaneously produce images that paralleled those found in Egyptian papyri or Gnostic texts? This question would haunt Jung and eventually lead him to his theory of the collective unconscious, the idea that beneath our personal memories and experiences lies a deeper stratum of the psyche, inherited rather than acquired, populated by universal patterns he called archetypes. These archetypes express themselves through symbols and myths, through dreams and fantasies, through the art and religion of every human culture across time. They were not learned, but innate, not individual, but collective, the psychological inheritance of the entire human species. Jung's collaboration with Sigmund Freud, which began in 1907, initially seemed like a perfect union of minds. Freud was the established master, the creator of psychoanalysis, the man who had dared to suggest that sexuality and unconscious drives shaped human behavior in ways that civilized society refused to acknowledge. Jung was the brilliant younger colleague, bringing validation from academic psychiatry, offering fresh perspectives and intellectual vitality. For several years, they corresponded intensely, met regularly, analyzed each other's dreams, and presented a united front to the world. But the collaboration was doomed by fundamental differences in worldview. Freud saw the unconscious primarily as a repository of repressed wishes, especially sexual and aggressive impulses that society forced us to hide from ourselves. Jung saw something far more expansive, an unconscious that contained not just personal repressions, but also creative potential, spiritual yearning, and the accumulated wisdom of ancestral experience. Freud was committed to a materialistic, reductionistic framework. Jung increasingly felt drawn toward meanings and purposes that transcended biology. The break came in 1912 and 13, a rupture so painful that Jung entered a period of profound psychological crisis. He retreated from the world, descended into his own unconscious through a process he called active imagination, and emerged years later with the foundational insights of analytical psychology. He had encountered what he called the collective unconscious, not through theory, but through direct experience, through terrifying visions and powerful dreams that seemed to come from a source deeper than his personal history. By the time Jung was formulating his mature psychology in the 1920s and 30s, he had become deeply interested in the relationship between conscious and unconscious processes. He saw consciousness as a relatively recent evolutionary development, a small island of light surrounded by the vast ocean of the unconscious. The ego, our sense of I. Our conscious identity was important but limited. It could plan, analyze, and direct voluntary action, but it was constantly influenced by unconscious forces it did not recognize or understand. Jung identified different functions of consciousness that operated in everyone, though in different proportions: thinking and feeling, sensation and intuition. Thinking evaluated things as true or false, while feeling judged them as agreeable or disagreeable. Sensation perceived the concrete reality of what is, while intuition grasped possibilities and underlying patterns. Most people had one dominant function, one auxiliary function, and two inferior functions that remained largely unconscious. This created characteristic blind spots and distortions in how we perceived reality. More fundamentally, Jung recognized that consciousness and unconsciousness existed in a compensatory relationship. When consciousness became too one-sided, the unconscious would produce dreams, symptoms, or external events that forced a correction. If someone identified too strongly with rational control, the unconscious might manifest chaos and emotionality. If someone became too inflated with their own importance, the unconscious might produce humiliating circumstances or anxiety states. The goal of psychological development, what Jung called individuation, was not to eliminate the unconscious, but to establish a relationship with it, to engage in an ongoing dialogue between conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche. This dialogue did not happen through logical reasoning alone. The unconscious spoke in symbols, images, and metaphors. It communicated through myths and fairy tales, through religious experiences and artistic visions. Jung spent decades studying alchemy, not because he believed in transmuting lead into gold, but because he saw in alchemical texts a symbolic description of psychological transformation. The alchemist's quest to create the philosopher's stone was really, Jung argued, a projection of the psyche's drive toward wholeness and integration. Now let us turn our attention across decades and continents to a very different world and a very different kind of mind. On March 5, 1934, in Tel Aviv during the British Mandate of Palestine, a boy was born who would grow up to revolutionize our understanding of human judgment and decision-making. Daniel Kahneman entered a world already shadowed by the gathering darkness of fascism. His parents were Lithuanian Jews who had emigrated to France before his birth, and when he was months old, his family moved to Paris. Young Danny's early childhood coincided with the Nazi occupation of France. In his later writings, he would occasionally reference memories from those years, the constant anxiety, the necessity of hiding one's Jewish identity, the close calls with danger. His father was arrested during a Gestapo raid, but was released after 6 weeks, dying of diabetes shortly after. These experiences left the boy with an acute awareness of how arbitrary fate could be, how quickly security could evaporate, how human cruelty could erupt from seemingly civilized society. After the war, Kahneman's mother emigrated with her children to British Palestine, which soon became Israel. Danny grew up in the newly established state, a place defined by both idealism and existential threat, where every decision seemed to carry enormous weight. He was a gifted student, intellectually curious, drawn to understanding how people thought and why they behaved as they did. Kahneman studied psychology at Hebrew University in Jerusalem in the 1950s, a time when the field was dominated by behaviorism in America and psychoanalysis in Europe. But a new movement was beginning to emerge, cognitive psychology, which sought to understand the internal mental processes that behaviorists had deliberately ignored. Rather than treating the mind as a black box that simply responded to stimuli, cognitive psychologists wanted to understand how people represented information, formed concepts, solved problems, and made decisions. After completing his undergraduate degree, Kahneman earned his doctorate at the University of California, Berkeley, in the early 1960s. His dissertation examined visual perception, but his interests were already broader, encompassing how people processed information and formed judgments about the world. He was interested in attention, what determines what we notice and what we overlook, how we allocate our limited cognitive resources among competing demands. In 1961, Kahneman returned to Israel and began teaching at Hebrew University. It was here, in 1969, that he met Amos Tversky, a meeting that would prove to be one of the most fruitful collaborations in the history of psychology. Tversky was also an Israeli psychologist, slightly younger than Kahneman, with a background in mathematics and a fierce intellectual style. Where Kahneman was intuitive and exploratory, prone to doubt and revision, Tversky was confident and logically rigorous. Where Kahneman worried about whether their ideas were correct, Tversky was convinced of their validity and eager to push forward. The collaboration began with conversations about how people made judgments under uncertainty. Standard decision theory, developed by mathematicians and economists, assumed that people were rational actors who carefully calculated probabilities and utilities before making choices. But Kahneman and Tversky suspected this was wrong. They believed that people relied on mental shortcuts, heuristics that generally worked well but sometimes led to systematic errors. Their early work focused on identifying these heuristics and the biases they produced. The availability heuristic, for example, described how people judge the frequency or probability of events based on how easily examples come to mind. After hearing about airplane crashes on the news, people overestimate the danger of flying because those dramatic examples are readily available in memory. The representativeness heuristic described how people judged probabilities based on similarity or typicality, often ignoring base rates and statistical principles. If someone seemed to match the stereotype of a librarian rather than a farmer, people would judge them more likely to be a librarian even when told that farmers vastly outnumber librarians in the population. Through a series of elegant experiments in the 1970s, Kahneman and Tversky demonstrated that these heuristics were not occasional errors but systematic features of human cognition. They showed that even statistically sophisticated people, scientists, physicians, judges, consistently made predictable mistakes when reasoning under uncertainty. These were not random errors, but pattern distortions, the signatures of underlying cognitive mechanisms. The implications were profound. If human judgment was systematically biased, then many of the assumptions underlying economics, law, medicine, and public policy needed to be reconsidered. Kahneman and Tversky's work suggested that people were not the rational utility maximizers that economic theory assumed. Instead, we were cognitive misers, using mental shortcuts that saved time and effort but often led us astray. In 1979, Kahneman and Tversky published their landmark paper on prospect theory, which described how people actually make decisions involving risk and uncertainty. They showed that people's choices violated the axioms of rational choice theory in systematic ways. People were loss-averse. A loss hurt more than an equivalent gain felt good. People evaluated outcomes relative to a reference point rather than in absolute terms. People treated probabilities in psychologically complex ways, overweighting small probabilities and underweighting moderate and high probabilities. Prospect theory provided a descriptive alternative to the normative models of rational choice. It described how people actually decided, not how they should decide according to the laws of logic and probability. This distinction between normative and descriptive theories of reasoning became central to Kahneman's work. He was not primarily interested in telling people they were irrational and should do better. He wanted to understand the mechanisms underlying human judgment, to map the architecture of the mind as it actually functioned. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Kahneman began working on a framework that would integrate decades of research on judgment and decision-making. This framework centered on what he called System 1 and System 2 thinking. System 1 was fast, automatic, intuitive, and effortless. It operated below the level of conscious awareness, generating impressions, feelings, and inclinations. System 2 was slow, deliberate, analytical, and effortful. It required conscious attention and mental resources. System 1 was responsible for most of our moment-to-moment cognitive processing. It recognized faces, understood simple sentences, drove cars on familiar routes, and generated intuitive answers to questions. It was the source of our automatic emotional reactions, our snap judgments, our gut feelings. System 1 was highly efficient but also prone to systematic biases because it relied on heuristics and associations rather than careful analysis. System 2 was invoked when we needed to solve complex problems, make difficult decisions, or override our initial intuitions. It was the voice of conscious reasoning, the mental faculty that could check answers, weigh evidence, and follow logical rules. But System 2 was lazy and resource-limited. It required effort and could be easily depleted. When tired or distracted, we relied more heavily on System 1, becoming more susceptible to its biases. Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, published in 2011, brought this dual-process framework to a general audience. The book became an international bestseller, introducing millions of readers to concepts like anchoring, framing effects, the planning fallacy, and the endowment effect. It presented decades of research in a narrative that was personal and accessible, interwoven with Kahneman's own memories of his collaboration with Tversky, who had died in 1996. What made Kahneman's work so influential was not just its empirical rigor, but also its implications for human self-understanding. He showed that we are strangers to ourselves, that our conscious experience is built on foundations we do not perceive, that the story we tell about our own reasoning is often a retrospective rationalization rather than an accurate account of how we actually decided. We believe we are rational actors, carefully weighing evidence and making logical choices, but in reality, we are often driven by unconscious processes that generate quick intuitions and then construct plausible justifications after the fact. Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2002 for his work on prospect theory and judgment under uncertainty. It was a striking recognition for a psychologist, awarded in economics because his findings had fundamentally challenged and reshaped how economists understood human behavior. The rational actor model that had dominated economics for centuries was revealed as, at best, an approximation and, at worst, a misleading fiction. Throughout his career, Kahneman maintained a certain methodological discipline. He was committed to experimental evidence, to demonstrating phenomena through carefully controlled studies, to quantifying effects and testing hypotheses. He was suspicious of grand theoretical claims that could not be subjected to empirical scrutiny. His style was to build knowledge gradually, through accumulating evidence, through replication and refinement of findings. He was also acutely aware of the limits of his approach. Kahneman knew that laboratory experiments captured only a small slice of human experience, that the phenomena he studied in controlled settings might operate differently in the complexity of real life. He worried about whether findings would replicate, whether effects would prove robust across cultures and contexts. This humility, this willingness to doubt and question, was as characteristic of his work as the brilliant insights themselves. Now, as we stand at this juncture in our journey, having traced the development of these two extraordinary minds, let us consider how they might have encountered each other, whether in reality or in the realm of ideas. Jung died in 1961, when Kahneman was just beginning his academic career. They never met, never corresponded, never directly engaged with each other's work. Yet their paths crossed in the realm of ideas, in the questions they asked about human consciousness and the answers they offered. Did Kahneman ever read Jung? There is little evidence that he did so systematically. Jung's work was far from the experimental, quantitative tradition in which Kahneman was trained. By the time Kahneman was coming of age as a psychologist, Jung was often dismissed in academic circles as too mystical, too speculative, too willing to embrace concepts that could not be operationalized or tested. The kind of psychology that interested Kahneman, cognitive psychology, with its emphasis on information processing and mental mechanisms, had deliberately turned away from the depth psychological tradition that Jung represented. Yet there are intriguing hints of awareness. In Kahneman's writing about intuition, he occasionally references concepts that echo Jungian themes, though without attribution. His discussion of expert intuition, for example, the kind of rapid pattern recognition that allows chess masters to immediately grasp the structure of a board position, or firefighters to sense when a building is about to collapse, describes a phenomenon that Jung would have recognized as intuition in its positive sense, the function that grasps holes and underlying patterns without conscious reasoning. More broadly, Kahneman's entire project can be seen as addressing, in a different language and with different methods, questions that Jung also grappled with. How do unconscious processes influence conscious thought? Why do people so often deceive themselves about their own motivations and reasoning? What is the relationship between automatic, intuitive responses and deliberate, rational analysis? These are fundamentally Jungian questions, even if Kahneman approached them from an entirely different angle. The intellectual landscape that shaped both men, though separated by decades, contained common elements. Both emerged from Jewish backgrounds that had been touched by catastrophe. Jung witnessing the collapse of European civilization in the First World War, Kahneman living through the Holocaust as a child. Both were shaped by the recognition that human beings were capable of profound irrationality, that the enlightened rationalism of 19th century thought had failed to account for the darker and more chaotic aspects of human nature. Both were also responding, in different ways, to the legacy of Freud. Jung had worked directly with Freud and then broken away, arguing that psychoanalysis was too reductive, too focused on sexuality and pathology, too unwilling to acknowledge the creative and spiritual dimensions of the unconscious. Kahneman worked in a tradition that had largely rejected psychoanalysis, viewing it as unscientific and unfalsifiable, but his research on unconscious cognitive processes can be seen as offering an empirically grounded alternative to Freudian concepts of unconscious motivation. The 1970s, when Kahneman and Tversky were doing their most influential work, was also a period of renewed interest in consciousness and unconscious processes within experimental psychology. The cognitive revolution had overthrown behaviorism's prohibition on studying internal mental states, and researchers were beginning to investigate phenomena like implicit memory, subliminal perception, and automatic processing. This was happening entirely separately from the depth psychological tradition, with different methods and terminology, but it was addressing similar questions about the relationship between conscious awareness and unconscious mental activity. In this context, we can imagine a meeting that never happened, a conversation across the boundary between analytical psychology and cognitive science. What would Jung and Kahneman have said to each other? What would they have agreed upon, and where would they have reached impasses of mutual incomprehension? Let us enter that imagined space, that place between waking and dreaming, where two minds can encounter each other across the barriers of time, tradition, and temperament. Picture a room, perhaps somewhere outside ordinary space, a study with comfortable chairs, shelves lined with books representing both traditions, a window looking out on something neither entirely real nor entirely symbolic. Jung sits in one chair, an old man now, white-haired, his face creased with the lines of a life lived in depth, his eyes containing something ancient and penetrating. Kahneman sits across from him, younger, more uncertain, armed with papers and data, but also genuinely curious, genuinely seeking understanding. They might begin, as academics do, by establishing common ground. Both would acknowledge that human consciousness is not the transparent, unified thing we imagine it to be. Both would agree that we are driven by forces we do not fully understand, that our conscious reasoning is often a rationalization of decisions already made at an unconscious level. Both would recognize that human beings are capable of profound self-deception, that we construct narratives about ourselves that are convenient rather than accurate. You see, Jung might say, leaning forward slightly, his voice carrying the accent of German-speaking Switzerland, the conscious mind is like the visible portion of a mountain rising above the sea. We see only the peak, but beneath the surface lies a vast underwater structure that determines the mountain's shape and stability. The ego, our sense of I, believes itself to be autonomous and self-directing, but it is constantly influenced by contents from the unconscious that it does not recognize. Kahneman might nod, recognizing something familiar in this image even as he instinctively reaches for more precise language. We found something similar in our experiments, he might reply. We call it System 1, the automatic, unconscious processes that generate intuitions, impressions, and feelings. It operates constantly, below awareness, and often determines our judgments before system. 2. Our conscious analytical mind even begins to work. People are largely unaware of these automatic processes. They believe their judgments are based on careful reasoning, but our studies show that reasoning often comes after the fact, constructing justifications for conclusions already reached. Jung would listen attentively, perhaps with a slight smile, recognizing both similarity and difference. Yes, there is certainly an automatic aspect to the unconscious, but it is not merely mechanical. The unconscious is creative, purposive. It produces dreams and symbols that compensate for one-sidedness in consciousness, that point toward psychological growth and integration. It contains not just personal memories and associations, but also archetypal patterns inherited from our ancestral past. Here, Kahneman might pause, feeling the ground shift beneath him into territory he finds less comfortable. Archetypal patterns? I'm not sure what that means in terms we could test empirically. In our work, we focus on cognitive mechanisms that can be demonstrated through experiments, that can be quantified and replicated. When people make predictable errors in judgment, we can trace those errors to specific heuristics and biases. We don't need to invoke inherited patterns or ancestral memories. But do you not find, Jung might respond gently, that certain patterns recur across individuals and cultures? That people spontaneously produce certain kinds of images and stories, certain motifs that appear in myths and religions worldwide? A great mother figure, a wise old man, a hero's journey, death, and rebirth. I encountered these patterns in my patients' dreams and fantasies, and then I found them in ancient texts they could never have read. How do you explain such universal patterns if not through some kind of inherited psychological structure? Kahneman might shift in his chair, recognizing a challenge, but also a potential bridge. There are certainly universal aspects of human cognition. All humans have similar perceptual systems, similar emotional responses to certain stimuli. A baby in any culture will smile at faces, will be frightened by sudden, loud noises. These are evolved responses built into our neural architecture through natural selection. Perhaps what you call archetypes are something like evolved cognitive modules, specialized systems that developed because they solved adaptive problems in our ancestral environment. Jung would consider this carefully. Perhaps there is something to that formulation, though I think you are reducing something rich and meaningful to mere survival mechanism. Yes, these patterns evolved, but they evolved because they express something essential about human existence: birth, death, transformation, the relationship between masculine and feminine, the encounter with the unknown. They are not just cognitive shortcuts, but meanings, purposes, values, embedded in the structure of the psyche itself. They might return to the question of intuition, recognizing it as a point of potential convergence. Jung had identified intuition as one of the 4 fundamental functions of consciousness, the function that grasped possibilities and underlying patterns without going through step-by-step reasoning. He distinguished between intuitive types, for whom this function was dominant, and other types for whom intuition remained largely unconscious and undeveloped. Kahneman had studied intuition extensively, distinguishing between expert intuition and untutored intuition. Expert intuition developed through prolonged practice in a stable, predictable environment with immediate feedback. A chess master's intuitive grasp of a position, a physician's gut feeling about a diagnosis, these could be genuinely reliable when the expert had extensive experience in a domain, with regular patterns. But untutored intuition, the gut feelings we all have about matters where we lack genuine expertise, was often just System 1, producing answers based on superficial similarity or easy availability, leading to systematic error. You see intuition as sometimes valid and sometimes misleading. Jung might observe, "This resonates with my own view. Intuition can be highly valuable when developed, when trusted appropriately, but it can also be contaminated by projection, by unconscious contents that distort perception. An intuitive type might see patterns and possibilities that more concrete types miss, but they might also miss practical realities, overlook details, fail to ground their visions in actual circumstances. The question is how to distinguish reliable from unreliable intuition," Kahneman might respond. Our research suggests it depends on the environment and the quality of feedback. In chess or firefighting, there are clear patterns that can be learned through experience, and outcomes happen quickly enough that you get feedback on your intuitions. But in many domains, stock picking, political prediction, clinical psychology, without objective measures, there are no stable patterns, or the feedback is too delayed or ambiguous. In those domains, intuition is often just an illusion of validity. People feel confident in their judgments, but their actual accuracy is no better than chance. Jung might bristle slightly at the implied critique of clinical psychology, but he would also recognize the legitimate concern. It is true that in depth psychology, we often work with material that resists quantification. How do you measure the meaning of a dream, the significance of a synchronistic event? But this does not mean our intuitions are invalid. We develop a feeling for the psyche through years of experience, through our own inner work as well as work with patients. We learn to sense when an interpretation resonates, when a symbol opens up new understanding. But how do you know you're not fooling yourself? Kahneman might ask, not unkindly, but with genuine puzzlement. One of our most robust findings is that people are terrible at assessing their own competence. We have what we call the illusion of confidence, the subjective feeling of certainty that we're right has almost no correlation with whether we're actually right. Psychologists, like everyone else, are susceptible to confirmation bias. We notice evidence that supports our theories and overlook evidence that contradicts them. Without systematic, objective measures, how can we avoid simply seeing what we want to see? This exchange captures something essential about the difference between their approaches. Kahneman's work was built on demonstrating systematic errors in judgment, on showing that subjective confidence was unreliable, that intuition often led us astray. His entire methodological stance was skeptical, focused on identifying and correcting biases. Jung's approach, by contrast, trusted careful attention to subjective experience, to the nuances of meaning and feeling that could not be easily quantified. He saw value in ambiguity, in the irreducible complexity of individual cases, in meanings that revealed themselves gradually rather than submitting to experimental proof. Let us shift our attention now to the heart of their potential dialogue, the question of how unconscious processes influence consciousness, and how we should understand the relationship between automatic and controlled cognitive operations. This is where their frameworks most directly overlap, and where the differences in their interpretations become most instructive. For Jung, the unconscious was structured into layers. The personal unconscious contained material from an individual's own life, forgotten memories, repressed feelings, incompletely developed aspects of personality. This was roughly equivalent to what Freud had described, though Jung saw it as less dominated by repressed sexuality. Beneath the personal unconscious lay the collective unconscious, that deeper stratum of inherited psychological structure populated by archetypes. The unconscious was not simply reactive or mechanical. It had its own purposiveness, its own intelligence. It would produce dreams and symptoms that compensated for conscious attitudes, that pointed toward unlived potentials, that challenged the ego's illusions about itself. If someone became too inflated, identifying with only their strengths and positive qualities, the unconscious would produce dreams featuring shadow figures, dark, threatening characters representing the disowned aspects of personality. If someone's consciousness became too rational and controlled, the unconscious might erupt with chaotic emotions or irrational impulses. Jung saw the relationship between conscious and unconscious as fundamentally dialectical individuation, the process of psychological development involved an ongoing conversation between ego and unconscious. The ego needed to maintain its structure and stability, its capacity for directed thought and voluntary action. But it also needed to remain open to messages from the unconscious, to integrate contents that challenged its self-understanding, to gradually expand its awareness to include more of the total psyche. This process was mediated through symbols. The unconscious could not speak directly in the language of consciousness, in clear logical propositions. It communicated through images, through dreams and fantasies, through artistic and religious expressions. These symbols were not allegories with simple, fixed meanings, but living realities that contained multiple layers of significance. The same symbol might mean different things to different people, or different things to the same person at different stages of life. Understanding symbols required a particular kind of attention that Jung called amplification. You could not simply decode a symbol by looking it up in a dictionary. You had to sit with it, explore its associations in mythology and religion, attend to the feelings it evoked, let it work on you over time. The meaning of a symbol emerged through this engagement, through the dialogue between conscious reflection and unconscious response. Now, consider Kahneman's framework, which approaches these questions from an entirely different angle. System 1 is automatic, associative, and rapid. It processes information through pattern matching, through activation of associated memories and concepts. When you see a word on a page, you cannot help but read it. When you see a face, you automatically make judgments about trustworthiness and emotion. When you encounter a situation, System 1 immediately generates impressions and feelings based on similarity to previous experiences. System 1 creates what Kahneman calls associative coherence. It links things together based on contiguity and resemblance, building a network of associated meanings. If you think of banana, related concepts like yellow, fruit, and peel are automatically activated. This associative network is useful for navigating the world quickly, but it also produces systematic distortions. Things that are associated in our minds seem more likely to occur together in reality. Events that are easily imagined seem more probable. Information that fits a coherent story seems more true. System 2 is controlled, deliberate, and slow. It requires attention and effort. It can follow rules, compare options, perform calculations, but System 2 is lazy. It accepts the suggestions offered by System 1 unless it has a specific reason to be suspicious. And System 2 has limited capacity. It can be depleted by prolonged use, distracted by competing demands for attention, overwhelmed by complexity. Much of what we think of as conscious reasoning is actually System 2 endorsing or slightly modifying the outputs of System 1. You think you're carefully evaluating evidence and reaching a reasoned conclusion, but often System 1 has already generated an intuitive answer based on crude heuristics, and System 2 is simply finding arguments to support that answer. The conscious story you tell about your reasoning is largely a post hoc rationalization. Kahneman identified numerous specific biases that arise from this architecture. Anchoring occurs when an initial piece of information, even completely irrelevant information, disproportionately influences subsequent judgments. If you spin a wheel that randomly lands on 65 and are then asked to estimate the percentage of African nations in the United Nations, your estimate will be higher than if the wheel had landed on 10. The random number serves as an anchor, and System 2 insufficiently adjusts away from it. The availability heuristic leads us to judge events as more frequent or probable when examples easily come to mind. After seeing news coverage of airplane crashes, people overestimate the danger of flying. After recalling instances of a friend's generosity, we judge them as more generous overall. The ease with which examples are retrieved is taken as evidence of frequency, even though what comes to mind easily often reflects media coverage or emotional salience rather than actual base rates. Representativeness leads us to judge probability based on similarity to stereotypes or prototypes, ignoring base rates and statistical principles. If Linda is described as concerned with social justice and having participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations, people judge it more likely that she's a feminist bank teller than that she's a bank teller, even though the first is a subset of the second and therefore necessarily less probable. The description seems representative of feminists, so System 1 generates the intuition that Linda is probably a feminist, and this intuition overrides basic logic. The confirmation bias leads us to seek and interpret evidence in ways that confirm our existing beliefs. We notice and remember information that supports our views while overlooking or minimizing contradictory evidence. We ask questions that will elicit confirming answers. We interpret ambiguous evidence as supporting whichever side we already favored. These biases are not occasional errors but systematic features of System 1. They arise from the basic mechanisms of associative memory and heuristic processing. They affect everyone, including experts in their own domains, unless specific corrective measures are taken. How might Jung respond to this catalog of cognitive biases? He would likely recognize many phenomena that he understood in different terms. What Kahneman calls the confirmation bias, Jung might see as related to psychological type. We naturally pay attention to information that our dominant function can process, while overlooking information that would require our inferior functions. A thinking type naturally notices logical relationships and tends to dismiss feelings as subjective and unreliable. A feeling type naturally attends to values and harmonies, while glossing over logical inconsistencies. What Kahneman calls anchoring and framing effects, Jung might understand as examples of how consciousness is influenced by the context and structure within which information appears. Jung recognized that the ego is not as autonomous as it believes, that its judgments are shaped by factors it does not recognize. But where Kahneman sees mechanical processes, associative networks, activations spreading along links of contiguity and similarity, Jung sees something more purposive and meaningful. Consider how each would approach a specific phenomenon. The gambler's fallacy, the belief that after a series of losses, a win is more likely, or after several blacks on the roulette wheel, red is due. For Kahneman, this is a clear example of representativeness. People have an intuitive sense that random sequences should look random, should have a balance of different outcomes. A long streak of one outcome doesn't look random, so System 1 generates the expectation of alternation, even though each spin is independent. Jung might see something deeper here, a manifestation of the human need for meaning and pattern, the psyche's resistance to pure chaos and randomness. The gambler's fallacy reflects what Jung called synchronicity, the human tendency to perceive meaningful connections between events, even when there is no causal connection. For Jung, this tendency was not simply an error, but an expression of something essential about how the psyche relates to the world. The psyche is oriented toward meaning, toward pattern, toward purpose. It rebels against the notion of pure randomness, of a universe of disconnected events with no significance. This points to a fundamental difference in how they evaluated human cognition. For Kahneman, there is a clear standard of rationality provided by logic, probability theory, and decision theory. Biases are deviations from this normative standard. People should judge probability according to Bayes' theorem, should evaluate options according to expected utility, should reason according to formal logic. The fact that people systematically deviate from these normative models is what makes their errors interesting and important. For Jung, there is no single normative standard of rationality. Different psychological types have different ways of evaluating reality, all legitimate within their own domains. Thinking is not superior to feeling. Sensation is not more valid than intuition. Each function provides a different angle on reality, a different way of knowing. The goal is not to conform to some external standard of correct reasoning, but to develop all the functions to some degree while recognizing which ones are naturally dominant and which remain inferior. Moreover, Jung saw value in phenomena that Kahneman would classify as irrational. The unconscious produces symbols and myths, synchronistic experiences and numinous encounters that cannot be evaluated by the standards of empirical rationality, but nonetheless carry profound psychological meaning. A dream might not be true in any factual sense, but it might reveal something important about the dreamer's psychological situation. A synchronistic coincidence might have no causal explanation, but the meaning attributed to it might catalyze psychological transformation. Let us explore this further through the concept of intuition, which both men studied but interpreted very differently. For Jung, intuition was a basic psychological function, one of the four fundamental ways of orienting consciousness. The intuitive function perceived possibilities, underlying patterns, and implicit meanings. It was the function that grasped wholes rather than parts, that leapt to conclusions, without going through intermediate steps. Jung distinguished between extroverted intuition and introverted intuition. Extroverted intuition focused outward, perceiving possibilities in the external world, always alert to new potential developments, new opportunities, new ways of combining elements. People with dominant extroverted intuition were enthusiastic initiators, always starting new projects, but often poor at follow-through and implementation. They could envision the future brilliantly, but might miss practical realities in the present. Introverted intuition focused inward, perceiving the inner images and patterns arising from the unconscious. It gave access to archetypal dimensions, to symbolic meanings, to the underlying structure of things. People with dominant introverted intuition, Jung among them, could see through surface appearances to deeper significance, but they might seem strange or impractical to more concrete types, lost in visions that others could not share or understand. In Jung's framework, intuition was not inherently superior or inferior to other functions. Each function had its strengths and limitations. The intuitive type might grasp patterns that the sensation type missed, but they might also overlook factual details that were obvious to the sensation type. The key was knowing which function was appropriate for which situation, and developing enough access to all functions to avoid one-sided distortion. Kahneman's approach to intuition was more pragmatic and more skeptical. He wanted to know when intuitive judgments were likely to be accurate and when they were likely to be misleading. His answer, developed with Gary Klein in a dialogue between the heuristics and biases tradition and the naturalistic decision-making tradition, was that intuition could be trusted when two conditions were met: a stable, regular environment where patterns could be learned, and prolonged practice with good feedback. A chess master's intuition about the best move could be trusted because chess has clear rules, regular patterns, and immediate feedback. Through thousands of hours of practice, the chess master had built up a vast repertoire of patterns in memory, allowing System 1 to recognize configurations and immediately suggest strong moves. Similarly, a neonatal nurse's intuition about which babies need urgent attention could be reliable, because the nurse had extensive experience in a domain with regular cues and prompt feedback about outcomes. But in many domains where people feel confident intuitions, these conditions are not met. Stock market pundits feel confident in their predictions, but the market is too complex and too influenced by random events for stable patterns to be reliably learned. Clinical psychologists feel confident in their diagnoses, but without systematic feedback mechanisms and validation against objective criteria, they may simply be responding to superficial cues that match their theoretical preconceptions. Kahneman's message was that subjective confidence is not a reliable guide to accuracy. People feel just as confident in intuitions based on crude heuristics as in genuinely expert intuitions based on extensive experience. The illusion of validity leads us to trust feelings that have no basis in reality. Only by examining the structure of the environment and the quality of feedback can we distinguish expert intuition from mere confident guessing. How would Jung respond to this? He might acknowledge that in domains amenable to clear measurement and feedback, Kahneman's criteria are useful, but Jung's work dealt primarily with domains where such clear validation was difficult or impossible. How do you objectively measure whether a dream interpretation is correct? What constitutes good feedback in psychotherapy? How do you validate an intuitive understanding of symbolic meaning? Jung would argue that some forms of knowing cannot be subjected to experimental validation without losing their essential character. The meaning of a symbol emerges through engagement, through dialogue, through a process that is necessarily subjective and individual. This does not make it arbitrary or invalid. It is a different kind of knowledge requiring different criteria of validation. Moreover, Jung would resist the implication that intuition is merely pattern matching based on previous experience. True intuition, for Jung, involved access to archetypal patterns that were not learned through individual experience, but were inherent in the structure of the psyche. When a patient spontaneously produced an alchemical image they could never have encountered in their ordinary life, this was not just their System 1 generating associations based on superficial similarity. It was the collective unconscious manifesting, the psyche's inherent structure expressing itself. This brings us to perhaps the deepest difference between their approaches, the question of meaning versus mechanism. Kahneman's framework is essentially mechanistic. System 1 and System 2 are described as systems, as cognitive mechanisms that process information in particular ways. Understanding these mechanisms allows us to predict and explain behavior, to identify when people will make errors and why. Jung's framework is essentially hermeneutic. Understanding the psyche means interpreting symbols, discerning meanings, recognizing purposes and compensations. A symptom is not just a malfunction, but a message. A dream is not just random neural firing, but a communication from the unconscious. Behavior cannot be fully understood without reference to its meaning for the individual, the story within which it makes sense. Consider how each would approach a specific case. Imagine a patient, call him Andreas, who is struggling with paralysis in decision-making. He has been offered 2 jobs, one more secure but less exciting, the other risky but potentially rewarding. He cannot choose and feels increasingly anxious and stuck. Kahneman might explore the specific heuristics and biases affecting Andreas's decision-making. Is he giving too much weight to worst-case scenarios because of the availability heuristic, perhaps because he recently heard about someone losing a job? Is he focused on potential losses rather than potential gains, exhibiting loss aversion? Is his reference point inappropriate, comparing the new jobs to some idealized standard rather than to his current situation? By identifying specific biases, Kahneman might help Andreas structure his decision-making more rationally, perhaps, by explicitly listing pros and cons, by considering base rates and statistical likelihoods, by using decision matrices or other tools that force System 2 to engage more carefully. Jung would approach the situation entirely differently. He would want to understand what the conflict meant psychologically, what it revealed about Andreas's inner situation. Perhaps the 2 jobs represent 2 competing aspects of Andreas's personality: security versus adventure, conventionality versus creativity. The paralysis might indicate that consciousness has become too identified with one side. and the unconscious is preventing a one-sided decision by creating equal and opposite pull. Jung might explore Andreas's dreams during this period. Perhaps Andreas dreams of two roads diverging in a wood, or of a battle between two armies, or of trying to marry two incompatible partners. These dream images would not be direct advice about which job to choose, but symbolic representations of the psychic conflict. By exploring the symbols, by amplifying their meanings, by attending to the feelings they evoked, Andreas might come to understand the deeper issue, perhaps not which job to choose, but what parts of himself he needs to integrate, what one-sided attitude needs to be balanced. The goal would not be to make a more rational decision in Kahneman's sense, but to make a more whole decision, one that acknowledged both sides of the conflict, that integrated conscious intentions with unconscious needs. Perhaps the resolution would come not from choosing one job or the other, but from finding a third option that synthesized elements of both, or from choosing one while consciously committing to finding other ways to express the unlived aspect of personality. This example illustrates how their different frameworks lead to different interventions. Kahneman's approach is corrective, identifying biases and implementing strategies to counteract them. Jung's approach is integrative, understanding the meaning of the conflict and working toward greater wholeness. Neither approach is simply right or wrong. Each illuminates aspects of the situation that the other might miss. Kahneman might help Andreas avoid predictable errors in evaluating probabilities and outcomes. Jung might help Andreas understand why the decision feels so fraught, what deeper issues it touches on, what it means for his development as a person. Let us turn now to the question of how each understood the limitations and distortions of consciousness. For Kahneman, the key concept is bias, systematic deviations from rational judgment. These biases arise from the heuristics that System 1 uses, from the limited capacity of System 2, from the substitution of easy questions for hard ones. When asked a difficult question like, "How happy are you with your life?" System 1 substitutes an easier question like, "What is my mood right now?" The answer to the easier question becomes the answer to the harder question, without System 2 noticing the substitution. This leads to systematic distortions. People's reports of life satisfaction are influenced by momentary factors like the weather or whether their favorite sports team won recently. Factors that have nothing to do with the overall quality of their lives. Similarly, when estimating risks or probabilities, System 1 substitutes affective evaluation for statistical calculation. If something feels scary, it seems more likely. If something feels safe, it seems less likely. This produces inversions where risks and benefits are negatively correlated in people's minds, even though they're often positively correlated in reality. Nuclear power feels scary, so people judge it as high risk and low benefit. Solar power feels good, so people judge it as low risk and high benefit. These biases are not random. They are patterned, predictable, built into the architecture of cognition, and they are largely immune to simple awareness. Knowing about bias does not make you less biased. Even researchers who have spent their careers studying these phenomena remain susceptible to them in their own judgments. For Jung, the distortions of consciousness were described differently, but were no less systematic. Jung spoke of one-sidedness, the tendency of consciousness to identify with certain functions, attitudes, or contents while repressing their opposites. The conscious personality, what Jung called the persona, represents an adaptation to external demands, a socially acceptable self. But this adaptation necessarily involves excluding parts of the total personality. What is excluded forms the shadow, not necessarily evil, but simply everything that the conscious ego does not identify with. For someone who prides themselves on rationality, emotion becomes shadow. For someone who identifies with niceness and agreeability, aggression becomes shadow. The shadow contains not just negative qualities, but also positive potentials that remain undeveloped because they don't fit the conscious self-image. Jung recognized that consciousness could not simply eliminate its one-sidedness. Consciousness necessarily involves selection, focus, exclusion. The ego needs to have a coherent identity, cannot embrace all possibilities simultaneously. But when the one-sidedness becomes extreme, when the ego is too inflated or too rigid, the unconscious compensates, producing dreams, symptoms, or external situations that force confrontation with the excluded aspects. This compensation was purposive, not mechanical. The psyche was self-regulating, constantly working toward balance and wholeness. A person who lived entirely in their intellect might have dreams full of earthy, instinctive images, or might develop physical symptoms that forced them to pay attention to the body. A person who identified only with their shadow, who indulged their worst impulses, might have dreams of wise figures or religious symbols, representing the potential for integration and higher consciousness. Jung also described the phenomenon of projection, the tendency to see in others what we do not recognize in ourselves. The shadow is typically projected onto others, who then carry qualities that actually belong to us. We see aggression, dishonesty, or weakness in others while remaining blind to those same qualities in ourselves. Similarly, we may project idealized qualities onto others, seeing them as possessing wisdom, creativity, or power that we fail to recognize as potential within ourselves. Can we see connections between Kahneman's biases and Jung's projections? Both describe ways that our perception of reality is distorted by unconscious processes, but the mechanisms described are different. For Kahneman, projection might be understood as a form of availability bias. We more easily recognize qualities in others that are already active in our own minds, even if we don't acknowledge them as belonging to us. Our unconscious aggression makes us hypervigilant to aggression in others, interpreting ambiguous behavior as hostile. For Jung, projection is more than just cognitive bias. It is a psychodynamic process, serving defensive purposes, but also carrying potential for growth. By encountering our shadow in others, we have the opportunity to gradually recognize and integrate those qualities. The person who irritates us most may be showing us something we need to acknowledge in ourselves. The qualities we admire most intensely in others may point toward our own undeveloped potential. Let us consider now the question of development and change. How does consciousness evolve, expand, mature? For Kahneman, the question is primarily about learning to recognize and counteract biases. This might happen through education, through exposure to statistical thinking, through implementing decision procedures that force more careful analysis. But Kahneman was somewhat pessimistic about the possibilities for individual change. He found that even people with extensive training in statistics and probability continued to make intuitive errors when thinking casually. System 1 remained stubbornly resistant to override. The subjective experience of confidence and certainty was just as powerful even after learning about biases. Kahneman saw more potential for organizational and structural interventions. Rather than trying to make individuals less biased, we could design decision-making procedures that corrected for known biases, checklists that force attention to relevant factors, algorithms that make predictions based on statistical patterns rather than intuition. Pre-mortem exercises that ask groups to imagine that a planned project failed and work backward to identify potential causes, counteracting optimism bias. For Jung, development meant individuation, the lifelong process of becoming more fully oneself, of integrating unconscious contents, of achieving greater wholeness. This was not a smooth progression, but a dialectical process involving conflict, crisis, and transformation. Individuation typically accelerated in the second half of life, in the period Jung called the afternoon of life. In youth, the task was to develop a strong ego, to establish oneself in the world, to achieve success in work and relationships. But at midlife, often triggered by crisis or loss, people began to question the persona they had built. The goals that once seemed important appeared hollow. The self they had become felt incomplete. This was the call to individuation, an invitation to explore the unlived aspects of personality, to confront the shadow, to integrate the contrasexual dimensions represented by the anima or animus, to establish a relationship with the self Jung's term for the organizing center of the total psyche, both conscious and unconscious. This process could not be rushed or reduced to technique. It required patience, attention, willingness to sit with uncertainty and ambiguity. It involved active imagination, dialoguing with figures from dreams and fantasies, allowing unconscious contents to express themselves and gradually integrating their messages. It involved amplifying symbols, tracing their meanings in mythology and religion, letting them work on consciousness over time. The goal was not to eliminate the unconscious or to make everything conscious an impossible and undesirable aim. It was to establish an ongoing relationship between ego and unconscious, to remain open to messages from the deeper psyche while maintaining ego structure and stability. The individuated person had not resolved all conflicts or achieved perfect balance, but had learned to live with tension, to honor both sides of competing demands, to remain in dialogue with the unknown. Kahneman might view this entire framework with puzzlement. How could you measure individuation? What would constitute evidence that someone had achieved it? Where is the experimental validation of these processes? The language of symbols and archetypes, of self-regulation and compensation, might seem to him a beautiful metaphor, but not a scientific explanation. Yet Kahneman might also recognize that his framework had limits, that it described the mechanics of judgment but not the experienced meaning of life. His work showed how people made decisions, but not how people found purpose, created identity, or navigated existential questions. It corrected errors in probabilistic reasoning, but did not address questions of value, significance, or ultimate concern. Let us imagine them discussing a specific phenomenon that bridges their interests, the question of narrative, and how people construct stories about their lives. Kahneman became interested in this late in his career, distinguishing between the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self lives moment by moment, experiencing pleasure and pain, satisfaction and frustration in real time. If you aggregated all these momentary experiences, you would get one measure of a life's quality. But this is not how people actually evaluate their lives. Instead, they rely on memory, and memory is constructive and selective. The remembering self creates a narrative, a story about what happened and what it meant. This story is heavily influenced by two factors: the peak, the most intense moment, positive or negative, and the end, how things turned out. The duration of experiences matters surprisingly little. A painful medical procedure that lasts 30 minutes with a peak pain of 8 out of 10 and ends at 6 out of 10 is remembered as worse than a procedure lasting 45 minutes with the same peak but ending at 4 out of 10. Even though the longer procedure involved more total pain, people make decisions based on their remembered narrative, not on the experiencing self's actual moment-to-moment quality of life. They choose vacations, relationships, careers based on anticipated memories rather than anticipated experiences. The remembered self dominates because it is the self that tells our story, that creates continuity and meaning across time. Jung would find this fascinating and would immediately recognize connections to his own work. The remembering self's construction of narrative parallels what Jung understood as the ego's retrospective interpretation of experience. The ego creates a story about who we are and what our life means, but this story is necessarily selective, necessarily shaped by unconscious factors. Moreover, Jung would point out that the narrative we tell ourselves has powerful effects on subsequent experience. If you remember your childhood as primarily traumatic, this memory structure influences how you interpret current relationships, what possibilities you can envision for the future. If you remember yourself as a victim, this identity shapes your choices in ways that may perpetuate victimization, but narratives can change. In Jungian analysis, telling and retelling one's story in the presence of an attentive other allows new elements to emerge, new meanings to surface, forgotten memories return, dreams add symbolic dimensions. Gradually, the narrative becomes more complex, more nuanced, more capable of holding contradiction and ambiguity. Jung would also emphasize that beneath the personal narrative lies the archetypal narrative, the universal story patterns that give shape to individual lives. Your personal story may follow the pattern of the hero's journey, or the tragedy, or the redemption narrative. These archetypal patterns are not chosen consciously, but emerge from the collective unconscious, providing structure and meaning to experience. Kahneman might respond that these archetypal patterns are simply learned cultural schemas, narrative templates we absorb from stories and myths, not inherited psychological structures. The hero's journey is common because it appears in many cultures' mythologies, and we learn it through exposure, not because it's built into the psyche. But this raises a deeper question that neither can fully answer. Why do certain narrative patterns appear across cultures and throughout history? Why does the hero's journey, the dying and rising god, the great mother, the wise old man, appear in cultures with no contact with each other? Is this merely convergent cultural evolution, solving similar adaptive problems with similar solutions? Or does it point to something more fundamental, to psychological structures that shape how humans experience and interpret reality? As we move deeper into their dialogue, we encounter the question that perhaps most divides them, the status of meaning. For Kahneman, meaning is something imposed on reality by System 1's pattern-seeking tendencies. We see faces in clouds, hear voices in white noise, perceive intention and agency in random events. This is not a flaw, but a feature of our evolved cognition in ancestral environments. The cost of missing a real pattern, a predator in the grass, was much higher than the cost of seeing a false pattern. So we are biased towards seeing patterns, finding connections, attributing meaning. But from a scientific perspective, most of these perceived meanings are illusions. Coincidences happen randomly. The universe is largely indifferent to human concerns. Statistical patterns in data reflect causal mechanisms or random noise, not purposes or intentions. When people see meaningful patterns in random sequences or attribute significance to coincidences, they are exhibiting the clustering illusion and the availability heuristic, mistaking randomness for pattern. For Jung, meaning is not imposed, but discovered. The psyche is oriented toward meaning, structured by meanings, organized around meanings. Symbols are not arbitrary, but carry inherent significance. Synchronistic events, meaningful coincidences with no causal connection point to an acausal connecting principle, a dimension of reality that science cannot capture because it operates outside the framework of causation that science assumes. Jung would acknowledge that sometimes we see patterns where none exist, that we can project meaning onto neutral events, but he would insist that not all experienced meaning is illusion. When a patient has a dream that precisely captures a psychological situation they have not consciously understood, when a synchronistic event occurs at a crucial moment of transformation, when a symbol emerges that unlocks years of confusion, these are not just cognitive errors, but genuine encounters with meaning. This disagreement reflects different metaphysical assumptions about the nature of reality. Kahneman's work assumes a naturalistic framework reality, consists of matter and energy organized according to causal laws, and consciousness is an emergent property of sufficiently complex neural information processing. Within this framework, meaning is subjective, something created by minds, not an objective feature of reality. Jung's worldview, especially in his later work, moved toward a different metaphysics, what he called the psychoid level, where psyche and matter are two aspects of a deeper unified reality. At this level, synchronistic connections become possible. Meaningful patterns can manifest that are not causally determined, and symbols can be genuinely revelatory rather than merely expressive. Modern science has largely sided with Kahneman on this point. The cognitive biases he identified are well established, replicated across numerous studies. The framework of dual process thinking has become influential across psychology, neuroscience, and behavioral economics. Jung's theories of archetypes and the collective unconscious remain controversial, difficult to test empirically, often dismissed as unfalsifiable speculation. Yet, there are developments in contemporary psychology and neuroscience that might bridge these perspectives in unexpected ways. Research on implicit cognition has shown that much of our mental life operates outside awareness, that unconscious processes shape perception, memory, decision-making, and behavior in ways we do not recognize. This unconscious processing is far more sophisticated than earlier models suggested, involving complex pattern recognition, affective evaluation, and behavioral preparation. The distinction between System 1 and System 2 parallels Jung's distinction between unconscious and conscious processes, though without Jung's emphasis on symbolic meaning and archetypal structure. Both frameworks acknowledge that consciousness is not sovereign, that what we experience as conscious reasoning is often a retrospective rationalization of decisions already made unconsciously. Research on embodied cognition suggests that thinking is not purely abstract symbol manipulation, but is grounded in bodily states and motor patterns. Conceptual metaphors that link abstract ideas to concrete experiences are not arbitrary, but reflect deep connections between bodily experience and conceptual understanding. This echoes Jung's emphasis on the unity of psyche and soma, his recognition that psychological processes have somatic expressions and vice versa. Studies of expertise and Intuitive judgment have shown that skilled performance in many domains depends on recognizing patterns through extensive experience, exactly as both Kahneman and Jung understood, though they interpreted the nature of these patterns differently. The chess master, the jazz musician, the experienced therapist all develop intuitions that arise from unconscious pattern recognition built through thousands of hours of practice. Neuroscience has begun to identify the neural correlates of conscious and unconscious processing, showing how different brain systems support automatic versus controlled processing, how attention modulates which information reaches consciousness, how emotional systems influence cognition even when we are unaware of their operation. This research provides biological mechanisms for phenomena that both Jung and Kahneman described psychologically. Yet these empirical advances do not resolve the deepest questions their dialogue raises. Even if we can identify the neural mechanisms underlying intuition or unconscious processing, we have not answered the question of meaning. Even if we can demonstrate that certain biases are universal and arise from how neural networks process information, we have not determined whether symbols carry inherent significance or are merely subjective projections. Let us rest for a moment in the space between their perspectives, not rushing to resolve the tension, but letting it work on us. Both men devoted their lives to understanding how the human mind works, how consciousness relates to what lies beyond its boundaries, how we can recognize and potentially correct the limitations and distortions of our knowing. Both recognized that we are not as rational as we believe, that unconscious processes constantly influence our conscious thoughts and choices, that subjective confidence is a poor guide to objective accuracy. Both saw that understanding these processes could lead to better decisions, richer self-knowledge, more authentic living. Yet they differed profoundly in what they took the unconscious to be. For Kahneman, unconscious processing is sophisticated but mechanical, the product of evolved information processing mechanisms that generally serve us well but sometimes lead us astray in predictable ways. For Jung, the unconscious is alive, purposive, creative, a source not just of automatic responses, but of wisdom, transformation, and encounter with what is ultimately real. Consider what it would mean if each were entirely correct, and what is lost if they are entirely wrong. If Kahneman is entirely right, then the universe is fundamentally meaningless. Human significance is a comforting illusion, and the best we can do is make decisions that maximize whatever we happen to value, recognizing that those values themselves have no objective basis. Psychology becomes a technical discipline focused on correcting cognitive errors and improving decision-making, but it cannot address existential questions because there are no answers to them. If Jung is entirely right, then reality is saturated with meaning. Human existence participates in larger patterns and purposes, and the psyche connects to dimensions of reality that transcend individual lives. Psychology becomes a depth hermeneutics, a discipline of interpreting symbols and navigating archetypal realities, but it struggles to establish empirical validation because its objects of study resist quantification and experimental control. But perhaps both are partially right, each illuminating aspects of human experience that the other's framework cannot fully capture. Kahneman helps us understand the mechanics of judgment, the systematic ways our thinking goes astray, the cognitive architecture that produces both insight and error. Jung helps us understand the felt significance of experience, the symbolic dimension of psychic life, the drive toward wholeness and self-realization that cannot be reduced to maximizing utility. We need Kahneman when making decisions that can be quantified and analyzed, when evaluating risks and probabilities, when trying to avoid predictable mistakes. We need Jung when facing existential questions, when trying to understand the meaning of our suffering, when encountering numinous experiences that resist literal interpretation. Or perhaps the distinction is not so neat. Perhaps every decision involves both calculation and meaning. Every choice is both a judgment under uncertainty and an expression of who we are becoming. Perhaps the dual process of System 1 and System 2 is nested within the larger dialectic of consciousness and the unconscious, and both are aspects of a psyche that is simultaneously a biological information processor and a meaning-making entity. Let us turn now to consider what their different approaches reveal about specific psychological phenomena, exploring how each framework illuminates and how each is limited. Consider first the phenomenon of depression. In Kahneman's framework, depression involves distortions in information processing. Depressed individuals show biased attention toward negative information, biased memory for negative events, and biased interpretation of ambiguous situations as negative. They engage in rumination, repetitive negative thinking that maintains the depressed state. They show learned helplessness, believing they have no control over outcomes even when they do. Cognitive therapy, developed by Aaron Beck and compatible with Kahneman's framework, aims to identify and correct these distorted thoughts. By recognizing negative automatic thoughts, testing them against evidence, and developing more balanced interpretations, people can reduce depression. The therapy essentially tries to engage System 2 to override the biased outputs of System 1 to substitute more rational evaluation for automatic negative thinking. This approach has been empirically validated and helps many people, but Jung would see it as addressing only the surface of depression, the cognitive symptoms without the underlying meaning. Jung would want to know what the depression is trying to communicate, what it says about the person's life situation and psychological development. Perhaps the depression arose because the person has lived too one-sidedly, pursuing goals that do not reflect their deeper nature. Perhaps it represents the death of an old identity that must occur before a new self can emerge. Perhaps it is the psyche's refusal to continue in a direction that violates soul. The depression, from this perspective, is not just a malfunction to be corrected, but a meaningful response, however painful, that deserves to be understood. Jung would explore the person's dreams during the depression, looking for symbolic representations of the psychological conflict. He would attend to the fantasies and images that emerged spontaneously. He would try to understand what needs to die and what wants to be born, what is being mourned, and what is seeking incarnation. The goal would not be to eliminate the depression as quickly as possible, but to go through it, to let it transform consciousness, to emerge from it having understood its message. This might take longer than cognitive therapy, might be more difficult and painful in the short term, but Jung would argue it leads to deeper transformation rather than just symptom relief. Are these approaches incompatible? Not necessarily. One could use cognitive techniques to manage the most severe symptoms while also exploring the depression's symbolic meaning. One could correct distorted thinking while also honoring the depression as a call to change. The tension arises when we insist that only one framework is valid, that depression is either a cognitive malfunction or a meaningful communication, but cannot be both. Consider another phenomenon, the midlife crisis. Kahneman might see this as partly explained by the focusing illusion, the tendency to overweight whatever we're currently thinking about in judging overall life satisfaction. At midlife, people become aware of mortality, of roads not taken, of the gap between youthful dreams and actual achievement. These thoughts, once activated, dominate attention and make the entire life seem inadequate, even though most aspects of life may be going well. The midlife crisis might also involve anchoring and adjustment. People compare their actual life to an ideal standard set in youth, and they insufficiently adjust that standard in light of realistic constraints and trade-offs. If you imagined at 20 that by 40 you would be famous, wealthy, and perfectly fulfilled, then at 40 you judge your actual accomplishments as failures, even if they are objectively quite good. From this perspective, the midlife crisis is a kind of cognitive error that might be addressed by perspective taking and reframing. Recognize that you're giving too much weight to negative aspects. Adjust your reference point to something more realistic. Focus on what you have rather than what you lack. Practice gratitude. Make incremental changes rather than blowing up your life. Jung saw the midlife crisis very differently, not as a cognitive error, but as a necessary developmental passage. In the first half of life, we build the ego, establish ourselves in the world, succeed according to external standards. But at midlife, the unconscious demands a change of direction. The persona that served us well becomes a prison. The goals that once motivated us lose their power. The unlived aspects of personality press for recognition. This is not a mistake, but the psyche's natural development. The crisis provides an opportunity for individuation, for discovering a more authentic self, for living the second half of life according to different values and priorities. Rather than trying to quickly resolve the crisis and return to normal, Jung would encourage descent into it, exploration of what it reveals, emergence with a transformed understanding of self and purpose. The resolution might indeed involve external changes, a new career, a divorce, a geographical move, but only if those changes reflect genuine psychological transformation rather than mere escape or acting out. More often, individuation involves internal changes, developing neglected parts of personality, establishing relationship with the unconscious, finding meaning beyond ego achievement. Again, we can see how both frameworks offer valid insights. Kahneman helps us avoid the most destructive manifestations of the midlife crisis, the impulsive decisions based on temporary moods, the cognitive errors that exaggerate dissatisfaction. Jung helps us recognize the crisis as potentially meaningful, as pointing toward necessary growth rather than mere dysfunction. Let us consider one more example, the experience of falling in love. For Kahneman, this might be understood through various biases and heuristics. The availability heuristic makes the beloved constantly present in consciousness, leading to overweighting their importance. The affect heuristic makes attributes that are emotionally positive seem more frequent. If you feel good about someone, you judge them as having many positive qualities, even though you lack sufficient information to support such a judgment. The halo effect makes judgments of specific qualities overly influenced by general impressions. If someone is physically attractive, you judge them as also more intelligent, kind, and trustworthy. Even though these qualities are independent, confirmation bias leads you to notice evidence that supports your positive view, while overlooking red flags and contrary information. From this perspective, falling in love is a kind of systematic cognitive error, an overconfidence in judgments based on insufficient evidence. The intensity of the experience, the certainty that this person is special and right for you, reflects System 1. Generating powerful intuitions based on crude cues, with System 2 failing to adequately check those intuitions against reality. Jung would see falling in love as projection, but not in a merely negative sense. We project onto the beloved qualities and potentials from our own unconscious, specifically the contrasexual aspect of personality, the anima in men, the animus in women. The anima represents a man's unconscious feminine qualities, his capacity for relationship, emotionality, intuition. The animus represents a woman's unconscious masculine qualities, her capacity for independence, rationality, spiritual striving. Falling in love feels numinous, overwhelming, fated because we are encountering not just another person, but our own unconscious, projected outward. The beloved seems magical because they carry something we need to develop in ourselves. This is why falling in love can be transformative, why it can catalyze psychological growth, why it feels like discovering something essential that was always missing. But the projection must eventually be withdrawn if the relationship is to mature. The beloved is revealed as a human being with flaws and limitations, not the idealized figure of early romance. This can feel like disillusionment, like love dying, but Jung would see it as necessary development. The qualities we projected onto the beloved must be recognized as our own and integrated. The partner is loved not as a carrier of our unconscious, but as a separate person in their own right. Can these perspectives be integrated? Kahneman's framework helps us understand the cognitive mechanisms underlying the intense but sometimes misleading certainty of early love. Jung's framework helps us understand the psychological meaning and developmental potential of the experience. Together, they provide a more complete picture, the mechanics of projection and the significance of what is projected, the biases that distort judgment, and the archetypal patterns that give the experience its numinous quality. Throughout this exploration, we keep encountering the same fundamental tension. Kahneman wants to explain psychological phenomena in terms of information processing mechanisms that can be empirically tested. Jung wants to interpret psychological phenomena in terms of meanings and purposes that emerge through hermeneutic understanding. Both are valid modes of inquiry, but they operate according to different logics and aim at different kinds of knowledge. Science, as Kahneman practices it, seeks causal explanations that are general and quantifiable. It asks, what mechanism produces this phenomenon? Under what conditions does it occur? How can we measure it? Can we predict it? This approach has enormous power within its domain, generating knowledge that is cumulative, testable, and often technologically applicable. Hermeneutics, as Jung practices it, seeks meaningful interpretations that are specific and qualitative. It asks, what does this phenomenon mean for this individual in this situation? What is it trying to express? How does it fit into the larger pattern of a life? This approach cannot generate the same kind of predictive power as science, but it addresses dimensions of experience that science struggles to capture: the felt significance, the existential import, the personal relevance of psychological phenomena. Perhaps we should not see these as competing, but as complementary. We need both the explanatory power of mechanism and the interpretive richness of meaning, both the objectivity of third-person measurement and the depth of first-person understanding, both the generality of laws and the specificity of individual experience. Modern depth psychology, in its best forms, attempts this integration. It draws on empirical research about cognitive mechanisms, developmental stages, and neural processes, while also attending to symbolic meanings, life narratives, and existential concerns. It uses quantifiable measures to track symptoms and outcomes, while also engaging in interpretive dialogue about dreams and fantasies. It recognizes that human beings are both biological organisms, subject to causal laws and meaning-making subjects who live through stories and symbols. Yet the tension cannot be fully resolved, because the two approaches sometimes make incompatible claims about reality itself. Is meaning discovered or imposed? Are symbols revelatory or merely expressive? Does the psyche connect to dimensions of reality beyond the physical, or is it entirely a product of neural activity? These are not just methodological questions, but metaphysical ones, and our answer shapes what we take psychology to be and what it can offer. Let us drift now into a more lyrical register, away from point-by-point comparison, and toward reflection on what this dialogue between Jung and Kahneman reveals about the human condition, about consciousness itself, about the eternal questions that both were, in their different ways, addressing. We are creatures of reason and symbol, calculation and meaning, mechanism and purpose. We live simultaneously in the measurable world of quantities and probabilities, and in the felt world of significance and value. We are both the cognitive system that Kahneman describes, processing information through heuristics, making predictable errors, subject to systematic biases, and the meaning-seeking soul that Jung describes, oriented toward wholeness, expressing itself through symbols, participating in patterns larger than individual existence. Both perspectives reveal our humility. We are not as rational as we imagine, not as transparent to ourselves as we assume, not as autonomous as we wish. Consciousness is not the master of the psyche, but one voice in a larger conversation, one perspective on a totality that exceeds its grasp. Yet both also reveal our dignity. Kahneman shows that even our errors follow patterns, that we are not merely random or chaotic, but structured, predictable, understandable. Jung shows that even our suffering carries meaning, that symptoms and crises point toward development and transformation, that we are capable of psychological growth toward greater wholeness. The conversation between Jung and Kahneman is the conversation between two fundamental human needs: the need to understand causally and the need to understand meaningfully, the need to measure and predict and the need to interpret and integrate. We cannot fully satisfy one need while ignoring the other. We are both engineers and poets of the psyche, both scientists and mystics of consciousness. Consider how this plays out in our actual lives. When you make a major decision whether to take a job, whether to end a relationship, whether to move to a new city, you need both frameworks. You need Kahneman's insights to avoid predictable errors. Don't be anchored by irrelevant information. Don't let loss aversion make you cling to a bad situation just because change is frightening. Don't trust your confidence as a guide to accuracy. Consider base rates and outside views. Make explicit what you're trading off. But you also need Jung's insights to understand what the decision means for your development. Which parts of yourself will be expressed or suppressed by different choices, what your dreams and fantasies reveal about your unconscious preferences, how the decision fits into the larger arc of your life's story. You need to attend to intuitions that may reflect wisdom deeper than conscious reasoning, even as you recognize that intuition can also be misleading. A life lived entirely according to Kahneman's principles would be optimized, but perhaps impoverished. All calculation and no soul, all efficiency and no meaning. You would make statistically better decisions, but might miss the symbolic dimension of experience, the numinous encounters, the sense of participating in something larger than individual gain or loss. A life lived entirely according to Jung's principles might be psychologically rich, but practically disastrous. All symbol and no strategy, all meaning and no mechanism. You would pay attention to dreams and synchronicities, but might miss obvious practical realities. Might make terrible decisions because you fail to notice your cognitive biases. Might confuse genuine intuition with wishful thinking. We need both, and we need to know when to emphasize one over the other. In domains where outcomes can be measured and patterns learned, where feedback is clear and reliable, Kahneman's framework is invaluable. Use algorithms and decision procedures rather than intuition. Recognize and correct for biases. Acknowledge uncertainty appropriately. In domains where significance matters more than optimization, where questions concern meaning and identity rather than probabilistic outcomes, Jung's framework becomes essential. Attend to symbols and dreams. Explore the psychological purpose of symptoms and crises. Engage in the dialectic between consciousness and the unconscious. Work toward wholeness rather than mere adjustment. But life rarely presents itself in neat categories. Most situations involve both calculable risks and existential meanings, both measurable outcomes and symbolic significance. The art of living involves holding both frameworks simultaneously, moving fluidly between them, knowing when to emphasize mechanism and when to emphasize meaning. This is perhaps what wisdom involves, not choosing one framework over the other, but developing the capacity to inhabit both, to recognize what each illuminates and where each becomes blind. The wise person can calculate probabilities when appropriate, but also recognizes when rational calculation reaches its limits. When something more than optimization is at stake, when meaning must take precedence over efficiency. Both Jung and Kahneman, in their different ways, were teaching us humility before the complexity of the psyche, humility before the limitations of consciousness, humility before the mysteries that persist despite our efforts at understanding. Neither claimed to have explained everything or resolved all questions. Both knew they had illuminated certain aspects of human psychology, while necessarily leaving others in shadow. Kahneman's humility showed in his constant questioning of his own findings, his worry about replication, his acknowledgement of what his framework could not address. He never claimed that cognitive bias research explained all of human behavior, or that optimizing decision-making was the whole of human flourishing. He simply offered tools for understanding and potentially improving a specific domain judgment under uncertainty. Jung's humility showed in his insistence that the psyche was ultimately mysterious, that symbols could not be reduced to allegorical meanings, that the self transcended ego understanding. He never claimed to have systematized all of psychology or to have provided final answers to existential questions. He offered maps and concepts that might help others navigate their own psychological development, but he knew that each person's journey was unique, that recipes and formulas were inadequate to the complexity of individual experience. Both men were, in a sense, cartographers of the unknown mapping territories of the psyche that had not been adequately charted. They used different instruments and represented the terrain in different scales and projections, but both knew they were mapping something real, something that exceeded their capacity to fully represent, and both understood that their maps would be superseded, that future psychologists would find errors in their work, would develop better concepts and methods, would see things they had missed. This did not diminish their achievements, but placed them rightly as contributions to an ongoing conversation, as steps in a long journey of human self-understanding rather than final destinations. As we drift toward the conclusion of our exploration, let us imagine one final exchange between these two minds, a parting reflection on what they have learned from each other, what they still cannot accept, what remains mysterious. Jung might say, "I see now more clearly how consciousness uses shortcuts, how it substitutes easy answers for difficult questions, how confident we feel about judgments that rest on thin evidence. Your work makes me more cautious about my own interpretations, more aware of how I might be seeing patterns that reflect my theoretical preconceptions rather than the patient's actual psychic reality. I recognize that intuition, even the trained intuition of the analyst, can be misleading. I will pay more attention to how my own biases might distort my understanding. But I cannot accept that all meaning is illusory, that symbols are merely associative networks, that the psyche is nothing but an information processor. I have encountered too much that resists such reduction, the numinous dream that transforms a life, the synchronistic event that occurs at the moment of crisis, the archetype that manifests identically in people with no cultural connection. There is something more than mechanism, something your framework cannot capture. I do not claim to fully understand it, but I cannot deny what I have witnessed." Kahneman might respond, "I appreciate your emphasis on individual meaning, on the felt significance of experience, on the transformative potential of psychological work. My research addresses mechanisms, but mechanisms are not the whole of human life. People do not live by probabilistic calculation alone. We need stories, purposes, values. We need to feel that our lives matter, that our suffering serves some purpose, that we are part of something larger. I have never claimed that cognitive psychology answers such questions, but I remain skeptical of your metaphysical claims. The collective unconscious, archetypes as inherited structures, synchronicity as a causal connecting principle, these seem to me unfalsifiable, unnecessary for explaining the phenomena you describe. Perhaps what you call the collective unconscious is simply the universal features of human cognition shaped by evolution. Perhaps what you call archetypes are cultural schemas transmitted through learning. Perhaps synchronicities are just coincidences to which we attribute meaning because of our pattern-seeking biases. I may be wrong. My framework may be limited, may miss dimensions of reality that your framework captures, but I need evidence, demonstration, replication. I need to see that your concepts explain phenomena better than alternatives, that they generate predictions that prove accurate. Until then, I remain in doubt. And here they might reach an impasse, not hostile, not dismissive, but recognizing a gap that neither can bridge. Jung cannot provide the kind of empirical proof that Kahneman needs without betraying what he takes to be essential about symbols and meanings. Kahneman cannot embrace Jung's metaphysical framework without abandoning the methodological principles that define his approach. Yet they can still respect each other's work, recognize that both are addressing something real and important, acknowledge that psychology is large enough to contain multiple approaches, each valid within its domain. And we, as listeners to their dialogue, need not choose between them. We can learn from both, use both, allow both to inform our understanding. We can be empirically rigorous in our thinking about judgment and decision-making while remaining open to symbolic meaning and psychological depth. We can correct our cognitive biases while also attending to our dreams. We can make better decisions through statistical thinking while also living, according to values and purposes that transcend optimization. The conversation between Jung and Kahneman is not resolved, but remains alive, continues in our own thinking, in how we navigate the tension between mechanism and meaning, calculation and significance, explanation and interpretation. Each of us must find our own way of holding both perspectives, of honoring both the scientific and the hermeneutic dimensions of psychology. As we approach the end of our journey together this night, let us gather the threads of what we have explored. We have traced the development of two extraordinary minds, one born in the Victorian era who pioneered depth psychology and explored the collective unconscious, the other born in the shadow of the Holocaust, who revolutionized our understanding of judgment and decision-making. We have seen how both recognized that human beings are not as rational as we imagine, that unconscious processes profoundly influence consciousness, that we systematically deceive ourselves about our own reasoning and motivation. We have explored their different frameworks for understanding this irrationality. Jung's analytical psychology, with its emphasis on archetypes, symbols, and the dialectic of consciousness and the unconscious. Kahneman's cognitive psychology, with its focus on heuristics, biases, and the dual processes of System 1 and System 2. We have examined specific phenomena through both lenses: depression, midlife crisis, falling in love, seeing how each framework illuminates different aspects, how each offers distinct interventions, how both are needed for a complete understanding. We have grappled with the fundamental tension between their approaches, Jung's hermeneutic interpretation of meanings versus Kahneman's causal explanation of mechanisms, Jung's embrace of metaphysical claims versus Kahneman's methodological naturalism. We have imagined their conversation, the points of contact, and the impasses of mutual incomprehension, the respect amid disagreement, the recognition that both are contributing to a larger project of human self-understanding, even as they operate according to different principles and pursue different aims. And we have reflected on what their dialogue reveals about the human condition, that we are both mechanical and meaningful, both subject to systematic biases and capable of symbolic depth, both evolved information processors and meaning-seeking souls. We need both frameworks to do justice to the full complexity of human existence. As you drift towards sleep, let these ideas settle gently in your mind. You are a cognitive system that makes predictable errors, that relies on heuristics, that substitutes easy questions for hard ones, that generates confident intuitions based on superficial cues. Knowing this can help you make better decisions, can make you appropriately humble about your judgments, can help you implement strategies and procedures that correct for known biases. But you are also a psyche that generates symbols, that dreams meanings, that participates in patterns larger than individual existence, that seeks wholeness and integration. Honoring this can help you live more authentically, can make you attentive to messages from the unconscious, can help you navigate crises as opportunities for transformation rather than mere problems to be solved. You are both, always both, simultaneously the dual process system and the meaning-making soul. Neither framework exhausts who you are or what you need. Both are gifts from two brilliant minds who devoted their lives to understanding human consciousness, each from their own angle, each with their own methods, each offering insights we cannot afford to lose. Sleep now with these thoughts as companions. Let them work on you below the level of conscious awareness. Let them converse in your dreams. Let them gradually integrate into your understanding. Tomorrow you will wake to your ordinary life with its demands and decisions, its joys and sorrows, its mixture of the meaningful and the mechanical. Perhaps you will see it slightly differently, through eyes informed by both Jung and Kahneman, able to recognize both the biases that distort your judgment and the symbols that point toward your development. The conversation between great minds never ends. It continues in each of us as we live our lives, as we make our choices, as we try to understand ourselves and each other. Jung and Kahneman have given us tools, concepts, frameworks that can help in this ongoing work. What we do with their gifts is now our responsibility, our opportunity, our challenge. Rest well in the knowledge that you have spent these hours in good company, listening to the dialogue between two seekers who illuminated different aspects of the same profound mystery, the nature of human consciousness, the workings of the psyche, the possibilities and limitations of self-knowledge. Their conversation continues in you as you carry forward what they have taught, as you navigate your own path between mechanism and meaning, between explanation and interpretation, between the measurable and the significant. Good night, wanderer. May your dreams carry messages from the unconscious, and may your waking mind learn to recognize its own biases. May you be both rational and symbolic, both skeptical and open, both rigorously empirical and deeply hermeneutic. May you hold the tension between Jung and Kahneman not as a conflict to be resolved, but as a creative polarity that enriches understanding. The conversation between these two great minds has no ending, only pauses, only moments of rest before continuing. Let this be such a pause. Let sleep come, gentle and deep, carrying you into that realm where consciousness releases its grip and other kinds of knowing become possible. Until we meet again for another journey through the landscape of psychological ideas, another exploration of how great minds converge and diverge, another deepening of our understanding of what it means to be human. Sleep well, dream deeply, wake refreshed, carrying with you something of Jung's depth and Kahneman's rigor, something of archetypal wisdom and cognitive clarity, something of both the symbolic and the systematic understanding of the mysterious thing we call the mind.